If you walked into a South African township taxi rank in the mid-2000s, you were met with a specific sonic landscape. Beneath the roaring engines of Toyota Quantums and the shouting of Q marshals, there was another sound blaring from small televisions at vendor stalls, the chaotic, high-pitched, unfiltered laughter of a nation looking at its own reflection. This was the golden age of direct-to-DVD township cinema, an industry built on shoestring budgets, rapid production schedules, and raw, physical comedy. At the absolute apex of this cultural phenomenon stood one character, a figure with oversized teeth, an exaggerated physical gait, and a sharp, chaotic wit that captured the imagination of millions, Madluphuthu. Portrayed by the late, legendary comedian, musician, and actor Oscar Mgudlwa, the character of Madluphuthu transcended simple low-budget entertainment. He became a living cultural monument. Films like Madluphuthu 1-2, My Shit Father, My Lotto Ticket, and Zulu or Shut Up were not distributed through traditional multi-million rand cinema chains like Ster-Kineka or New Metro. They didn't need to be. Instead, they weaponized an informal distribution network of street vendors, spaza shops, and local taxi ranks, selling thousands of physical copies across South Africa, Lesotho, Botswana, and Zimbabwe for under a 50 a pop, yet, despite his monumental footprint on the South African collective consciousness, the industry that birthed him remains widely misunderstood, and the man behind the character lived a life vastly different from the caricature he presented on screen. Following the heartbreaking passing of Oscar Mgudlwa on July 16, 2025, a profound wave of nostalgia swept across the continent. Audiences began to re-evaluate what these films meant, realizing that beneath the slapstick humor lay an ingenious blueprint for guerrilla filmmaking and a mirror to the socio-economic realities of post-apartheid South Africa. This is the Untold, long-form documentary essay uncovering the secret history, the systemic struggles, and the creative genius behind the phenomenon. Here are 10 things you completely missed, or never knew, about the Madluphuthu cinematic universe. The first and most enduring mystery of the Madluphuthu film franchise is the massive disconnect between the character and the actor who portrayed him. For over a decade, a vast majority of the South African public genuinely believed that Oscar Mgudlwa lived with a permanent physical or intellectual disability. The character was defined by a highly specific, grueling physical performance, a distorted, jutting jawline that prominently displayed oversized teeth, an intense, uncontrolled drool, asymmetric arm movements, and a staggered, dragging gait. Mgudlwa committed to this physical blueprint so flawlessly that when fans encountered him on the streets of Johannesburg or his hometown of Daveyton, they were frequently stunned to find a deeply articulate, soft-spoken, and structurally sound intellectual. This was not a casual bit of slapstick acting, it was an extreme form of physical theater that required immense bodily control. To maintain the facial contortion and the drool for 12-hour shooting days meant that Mgudlwa frequently suffered from severe jaw cramping and facial fatigue. His performance bears striking similarities to classical European commedia dell'arte or traditional African trickster theater, where the performer uses radical physical exaggeration to unlock a deeper psychological truth. Mgudlwa's ability to completely alter his human form fooled an entire generation, proving that he was not just a guy acting funny on a low-resolution camera, he was a master of physical method acting operating completely outside the traditional frameworks of formal drama schools. Long before Oscar Mgudlwa put on the fake teeth and the worn-out clothes of his iconic character, he was an ambitious young artist navigating the explosive musical landscape of late 1990s South Africa. He did not set out to change the face of South African film, he set out to change the face of Kwaito. In 1998, as post-apartheid youth culture was defining itself through the heavy, slowed-down house beats of the Kwaito genre, Mgudlwa was a primary member of the musical group Manchild, associated with the legendary group Mina No. He was deeply embedded in the sonic subculture of the East Rand, using music to articulate the triumphs and tribulations of township life. His musical talent caught the attention of some of the biggest names in the industry, leading to a major collaboration in 2001 with the late Kwaito icon Mapapatsi. During the height of the Izinja era, this musical foundation is critical to understanding why the Madluphuthu movies felt so structurally rhythmic and lyrically sharp. Mgudlwa understood cadence. He understood how words bounced off a beat, and when he transitioned into acting, he applied this musicality to his dialogue. His use of township vernacular, slang, and tsotsitaal, a localized urban dialect, was highly rhythmic. Even the background scores of the films, often produced by the legendary Sello, Chicco, Twala, relied heavily on these musical roots, blending Kwaito sensibilities directly into the comedic editing. Mgudlwa was a musician first, and his movies were essentially visual extensions of the Kwaito movement, raw, rhythmic, rebellious, and distinctively black. We cannot tell the story of Madluphuthu without talking about the industrial engine that built it. While Oscar Mgudlwa was the face of the franchise, the structural mastermind behind the curtain was Sello, Chicco, Twala, a titan of South African music and pop culture. Twala, famous for producing legendary anti-apartheid pop anthems and working with iconic figures like Brenda Fassie, looked at the South African film industry in the early 2000s and realized it was completely broken for working-class audiences. The mainstream film market was focused on high-end, glossy productions meant for international film festivals or wealthy suburban cinemas. Twala saw a massive, starved demographic, the millions of residents living in South Africa's vast townships who wanted to see stories that reflected their daily realities, sold at a price they could actually afford. Twala applied a radical, hyperlean manufacturing model to film production. He funded these movies out of his own pocket, bypasses the slow, bureaucratic red tape of government film funds, and shot them over the course of just a few days. Using minimal crew, consumer-grade digital video cameras, and local township homes as ready-made sets, Twala eliminated overhead costs completely. He didn't just produce the films, he composed the music, directed key sequences, and personally negotiated distribution deals with informal street vendor networks. Twala recognized that in the township economy, volume and accessibility mattered vastly more than cinematic lens flares. He democratized film production in South Africa, creating an entire economic ecosystem out of thin air. In international film studies, Nigeria's Nollywood is widely celebrated as a historic example of an informal, straight-to-video film economy that grew into a multi-billion-dollar empire. What many global film historians completely overlook is that the Madluphuthu franchise represents South Africa's most successful, culturally pure equivalent to the Nollywood model. During the mid-2000s, the official South African film industry was heavily dependent on the National Film and Video Foundation (NFVF) and institutional broadcasters like the SABC. This meant that to get a movie made, it had to appeal to corporate executives, script committees, and middle-class sensibilities. Madluphuthu completely shattered this dynamic. By avoiding the formal film ecosystem, these movies created an autonomous black-owned cinema culture. They proved that an alternative economy existed, one driven entirely by the purchasing power of the working class. It was a cinema of immediacy, where a movie could be conceived, shot, edited, burned onto a disc, and sold at a taxi rank within the span of 2 weeks, addressing current social trends and cultural anxieties in real time. If you were to search for a formal, scene-by-scene script for Madluphuthu 1 or My Shit Father, you would find absolutely nothing. These films were almost entirely unscripted. The production style was built entirely around situational improvisation. Chicco, Twala and Oscar Mgudlwa would develop a basic narrative premise. For instance, Madluphuthu accidentally wins the national lottery, or Madluphuthu has to deal with an incredibly toxic, deadbeat father, and establish a few key plot milestones that needed to occur to advance the story. Beyond that, the cameras would roll, and the actors were given total creative freedom to build the scene on the fly. We didn't need long scripts. We knew the township. We knew how people argued, how they laughed, and how they survived. We just brought our real lives to the camera and let it flow. From a retrospective interview with the production circle, this approach transformed the shooting set into an open laboratory for comedic experimentation. Mgudlwa's co-stars had to be incredibly sharp, operating like jazz musicians who had to react instantly to whatever bizarre, erratic conversational curveball he threw at them. This reliance on improvisation is precisely why the dialogue feels incredibly alive, authentic, and modern even decades later. It lacked the stiff, overly formal translations that frequently plague African vernacular scripts written by corporate writers. The characters spoke exactly like real people standing on a street corner in Vosloorus or Soweto. To the untrained eye, a movie like My SHT Father looks like nothing more than loud, vulgar, lowbrow entertainment designed for cheap laughs. But if you strip away the cartoonish sound effects and look at the actual thematic spine of the narrative, you find a devastatingly accurate piece of social realism that subverts the traditional African family structure. The film explores the deeply painful, widespread societal issue of toxic, absent, or financially exploitative parental figures in the township. It deals with a father who actively steals from his own children, abuses his community's trust, and destabilizes his household. In a traditional African cultural context, parental authority is deeply revered and rarely challenged openly in public media. By weaponizing comedy, Mgudlwa and Twala were able to mount a radical critique of broken patriarchy and familial dysfunction. Madluphuthu's absurd, clownish persona acted as a form of ideological camouflage. Because the character was framed as a fool, he was allowed to say incredibly profound, uncomfortable truths about poverty, unemployment, greed, and structural neglect that a straight-acting dramatic character could never get away with saying without causing immediate public discomfort. It was a classic deployment of the Shakespearean fool, the only character in the kingdom permitted to tell the king he is naked. The true genius of the Madluphuthu cinematic universe did not just lie in how the films were made, but in how they were aggressively moved through space. Mainstream film distribution relies on massive marketing budgets, billboards, trailers, and structural gatekeepers. The straight-to-DVD township film market pioneered a highly sophisticated form of guerrilla distribution that integrated directly into the informal transport economy of South Africa. The primary point of sale for these movies was the taxi rank. In South Africa, the minibus taxi industry is the circulatory system of the working class, moving millions of commuters daily. Producers like Twala realized that if you capture the taxi ranks, you capture the nation. They built relationships with informal music and DVD vendors who set up tables right next to the busiest loading lanes. Furthermore, long-distance taxi drivers were given promotional copies of the DVDs to play on the small screens installed inside their vehicles during long trips between Johannesburg and provinces like Limpopo, KwaZulu-Natal, or the Eastern Cape. Commuters would sit in a taxi for 4 hours, watch Madluphuthu 2, laugh hysterically with 15 strangers, and immediately buy a physical copy from a vendor the moment they stepped out of the vehicle at their destination. It was an incredibly effective, self-sustaining word-of-mouth marketing engine that required zero corporate advertising capital, despite selling hundreds of thousands of copies over its lifespan and generating massive cultural capital. The Madluphuthu film series is almost completely missing from the formal archives of South African cinema history. If you look up academic books on South African film history, you will find extensive chapters dedicated to high-art political dramas or white-authored anti-apartheid films. But you will find almost no mention of the direct-to-DVD explosion. This erasure is an institutional tragedy driven by a deep sense of classist elitism within the country's cultural elite. Because these movies were shot on low-resolution digital video, featured unpolished editing, and catered deliberately to the tastes of the underprivileged working class, they were completely dismissed by film critics and academics as trash cinema. They were never nominated for South African Film and Television Awards, SAFTAs, they were never preserved by National Film Archives, and they were never studied in elite university lecture halls. This systematic blind spot means that the actual history of what real South Africans were watching during the decade of the 2000s has been largely wiped clean from the official record. The people who kept the lights on in the informal acting sector, the crews who learned how to shoot under extreme pressure, the actors who made a living when the mainstream broadcasters refused to hire them, were rendered completely invisible by a formal industry that valued elite aesthetics over raw cultural utility. One of the darkest, most heartbreaking realities of the low-budget South African DVD boom is the deep financial precarity experienced by its biggest stars, including Oscar Mgudlwa himself. To the public, Madluphuthu was an immensely wealthy celebrity because his face was everywhere. In reality, the economic structure of direct-to-DVD filmmaking offered very little long-term financial security. Because these films operated almost entirely in the informal market, they were utterly defenseless against the rampant wave of physical piracy. Within 24 hours of a legitimate Madluphuthu DVD being released, counterfeit operations would buy a single copy, duplicate it thousands of times using cheap blank discs, and sell them on urban street corners for a fraction of the price. The actual production house lost millions in potential revenue, which meant that actors were rarely paid ongoing royalties for their work. Instead of receiving continuous residual payments every time a family sat down to watch one of his movies, Mgudlwa was typically paid a flat, one-off upfront fee for a shooting session. When the DVD market collapsed entirely in the 2010s due to the rise of digital smartphones, internet piracy, and streaming platforms, many of these iconic township actors were left stranded with zero income, while Mgudlwa brilliantly managed to reinvent himself later in life, landing vital roles on major institutional television shows like E.TV's The Black Door and its spin-off Isata. The enemy as the character Jupiter, his mid-career struggles highlight the broken system where cultural icons are deeply loved by the public but structurally abandoned by the financial architecture of the entertainment industry. When Oscar Mgudlwa tragically passed away on July 16, 2025, after suffering sudden breathing complications at a hospital in Rosettenville, Johannesburg, the mainstream media scrambled to put together retrospectives. But if you want to see where his true legacy lives on, you don't look at traditional television broadcasts, you look at the digital landscape of the internet. Decades after those low-budget DVDs were recorded, Madluphuthu has found a massive, explosive second life in the creator economy. Clips from his mid-2000s catalog have become the bedrock of South African internet culture, serving as viral TikTok audios, WhatsApp reaction GIFs, and Twitter memes. A new generation of youth, many of whom were not even born when Sello, Chicco, Twala was running around the streets of Davidton with a video camera, are using Mgudlwa's facial expressions and vocal improvisations to express their contemporary frustrations, joys, and social commentary. This digital renaissance proves that the work Mgudlwa did was fundamentally timeless. He captured something elemental about the South African spirit, the ability to find unbridled, defiant joy in the middle of structural hardship. He took the pain, the chaos, and the specific absurdities of post-apartheid township life and turned them into art. The Madluphuthu movies were never about high-end cameras or corporate validation. They were about a community seeing itself clearly, laughing at its own scars, and surviving. Oscar Mgudlwa didn't just make low-budget comedies, he built an enduring archive of the South African soul.